All right. Again, August, thank you so much for the introduction. And I'm really grateful for the invitation to speak tonight. I'm grateful to all of you in the virtual audience for joining me. It's a real pleasure to have the opportunity to tell you about one of my recent research expeditions. It's what I characterize as a high-risk, high-reward project that revealed a mystery whale off of our very own Oregon coast. It's a fascinating story about a very poorly known group of whales, and that group of whales still remains among the least known vertebrates on the planet. But before I dive in, I'd like to give you a very brief orientation to my professional home, because a lot of my story depends on the people and the resources that are at Oregon State University's Marine Mammal Institute. As August mentioned, I am the director of OSU's Marine Mammal Institute, and we are located along the central coast of Oregon in Newport at the Hatfield Marine Science Center. Our mission is to integrate research, graduate education, and outreach to advance our knowledge of marine mammals, train the next generation of professionals, and engage with stakeholders to ensure that these animals and their ecosystems are always healthy. And everything we do is guided by our principles and goals, and that is scientific rigor, basic research with strong links to real-world applications, community engagement, and positive impacts, ranging from local through to national and up to global scales. We at the Marine Mammal Institute are 8 professors and labs with expertise in complementary disciplines that are all related to marine mammals. We are 9 additional principal investigators and the coordinator of the Oregon Marine Mammal Stranding Network, along with 13 research, seagoing, and administrative staff. We are also a thriving graduate student and postdoctorate community of 35 and growing. We have our own research vessel, the Pacific Storm, and I'll tell you a little bit more about her during the main part of my talk. We have a fleet of small boats that we use primarily for research here off the coast of Oregon. And we have a new building with research labs, classrooms, and state-of-the-art technology. And I would invite all of you in the audience, if you find yourselves in Newport, to please come visit us in the Gladys Valley Marine Studies building. It's a public building, and I'd love to welcome you here and show you around. Without a doubt, we do cool science, and it's also science with real world impact. And my story tonight is both of those. But right now, I want to take 2 minutes to show you some snippets of what we do through a really brief video. And I'm going to reshare. And start that. Okay. So, thanks for that opportunity to give you a little bit of overview of the Oregon State University's Marine Mammal Institute. It's a really exciting, thrilling place to be. Taylor Chappell, I didn't realize, who will speak to you next, has his office right down the hall from me here. So what I would like to do now with the rest of my time this evening is return to my main story tonight. And that is about a mystery whale uncovered off of our coast of Oregon. By way of introduction, let me tell you all that when we think of whales, many of us think about animals like this one. This is a blue whale, the largest animal ever to have lived on the planet. Blue whales are increasing in numbers along the west coast of North America, including right here off of Oregon. And in this particular photograph, those are bottlenose dolphins bow riding on the wave that this whale is creating as it swims through the water. Here's another animal that comes to mind when we think of whales, the humpback whale. This photo was taken from a drone, and it shows 3 animals blowing bubbles as they swim in ever-tightening circles to herd small fish into a tight school. It's more efficient for feeding for them. Humpback whales are also common off the coast of Oregon. Especially for those of us here in Oregon, when we think of whales, we often think of the gray whale. This mother-calf pair is migrating along the west coast from their breeding grounds in lagoons of Baja California, Mexico, to their feeding grounds offshore of Oregon and on up to Alaska. This is a sperm whale, another animal that comes to mind when we think of whales. Sperm whales are deep divers, feeding on squid. They are highly social with lifespans paralleling humans. And of course, sperm whales are of Moby Dick fame. And finally, when we think of whales, how can we not think of what is perhaps the most recognizable large animal in the ocean, the killer whale? They are highly social, pack hunters, and predators of all things that swim in the oceans, even the largest of whales. Killer whales, too, frequent waters along our Oregon coast. But tonight I'm going to talk about an entire family of whales in the world's oceans that many have never even heard of and few have ever even seen. They are known as beaked whales, and they are of the family Ziphiidae. There are 23 species currently recognized in this group. They are found in all oceans of the world, from Arctic seas in the far north to the Southern Ocean that surrounds Antarctica and everywhere in between. They're almost entirely found where the ocean is deep, and although small by whale standards, typically between 15 and 40 feet long, they can weigh up to 12 tons, and that places them among the largest 0.001% of all animals on the earth. They are a reason that these are best depicted as a group with this series of drawings of all the marine mammals. This is by far the most poorly marine group. Let me tell you a little bit about what we do know. Beaked whales are what we call extreme divers. They dive for long periods of time, and they dive to extreme depths. This particular animal that you see here is Cuvier's beaked whale. By placing satellite tags on animals of this species, we know they dive to almost 3,000 meters. That's just under 10,000 feet, equivalent to an 800-story building, or about 7 Empire State Buildings tall. During those deep dives, they can remain underwater for as long as 2 hours and 17 minutes. Deep dives for long periods of time are characteristic of all beaked whales. Why do they dive so deep? This is the answer. Their favorite food is squid. and squid are abundant deep below the ocean surface. In fact, at these depths, there is no light at all. These whales feed in complete darkness. They locate their prey not using vision, but using echolocation, producing sounds and listening to the echoes as the sound waves reflect off of objects in the water. And that includes squid, like these. All beaked whales have extremely well-developed echolocation capabilities, and during their dives, they vocalize, produce these echolocation clicks. They do that constantly. But when they come to the surface, they are silent, and I'll tell you why in a minute. Beaked whales have bizarre teeth. This photo shows you Blainville's beaked whale. This particular animal is swimming to the left, and you can see its upper and lower jaws at the far left. They form what we call a beak, the pointed piece near the front of the head. Near the center of this photo are two protuberances at the top of the head, and those are teeth. There is one tooth on each side of the head, and both of these erupt from the lower jaw, which in this species forms an arch that reaches above the top of the skull. Most beaked whale species have this peculiar dentition, only two teeth, and only in the lower jaw, one on each side. Every species of beaked whale has teeth that are different from all other species, and this drawing shows the lower jaw of 7 beaked whale species on the right, and on the left, a drawing of the top view of a typical beaked whale skull. So back to the right, the lower jaws, you can clearly see that the size, shape, and placement of the teeth are all different. What do they use these teeth for? Not feeding. In fact, only adult males have teeth. Females remain toothless their entire lives. The males use these teeth to fight each other for access to breeding females. And although these battles have never been witnessed, they must be fierce, because when jousting males rake each other with their teeth, they sometimes leave deep bleeding furrows along each other's bodies. This is another photo of Blainville's beaked whale, and this is a young male. Its teeth have not yet erupted from the lower jaw, but the parallel rake marks you can see on the right side of this photo, those rake marks were made by another male scraping with its teeth. And by the way, those polka dots you see on this animal, those are scars left by something known as a cookie cutter shark. And that's a story for a different time. This is what an older beaked whale looks like. This is southern bottlenose whale. And as you can see, this male has a lot of battle scars that are left on it by the teeth of other males. And look at this. This is another Blainville's beaked whale. It shows rake marks and deep furrowed scars from incredibly aggressive encounters with other males. That's the left tooth that points up above the skull, and you can see that the right tooth is broken, probably broken from combat with another male. This is strap-toothed beaked whale. The teeth of males in this species grow over the top of the upper jaw, constraining it so that the mouth cannot open more than about an inch. And the tooth that I'm holding in the photo on the right shows the sharp denticle at the top that's outlined by that blue circle. That denticle is what is used to gouge other males. Bizarre teeth indeed. One last general characteristic of beaked whales I want to mention is their behavior at the surface. When beaked whales surface to breathe, they stop vocalizing, and they stop vocalizing several minutes and several hundred meters below the surface. Then, instead of coming straight up to the surface from the depth, they veer off in random directions. At the surface, beaked whales take a few quick gulps of air, and then they descend to several hundred meters for 10 minutes or more before they come to the surface again. They do a series of these relatively shallow breathing dives before they make their next foraging dive that is deep. So why this erratic and silent surfacing? Despite their size and deep and long dives, beaked whales are vulnerable, and they're vulnerable to killer whales. Killer whales are the predatory kings of the ocean. There are records and there are photos of killer whales attacking, killing, and eating beaked whales. So it's not surprising that beaked whales have evolved various behaviors that help them minimize contact with killer whales. The less time beaked whales spend at the surface, the less noise they make there, the less likely they are to attract killer whales. So this photo shows a Baird's beaked whale at the surface. And this enlargement reveals tooth rake scars on its dorsal fin. Those scars were left by an attacking killer whale. This particular whale got away, but Baird's beaked whales often have killer whale tooth rake marks on them, and we assume that others aren't so lucky. Little wonder beaked whales are wary of their time spent at the surface. And this includes their timidness around vessels. Typically around vessels, they slip below the surface shortly after being sighted. And typically because of their long dives, once they go under, we don't see them again. All of these factors, that they are so oceanic, that they are found in small groups, that they do deep and long dives, and that they are silent and evasive at the surface. All of these factors combine to make beaked whales the most poorly known family of all whales. In fact, of all marine mammals, they are the most poorly known. Of the 23 known species of beaked whales, 5 have been added since the mid-1960s. And 6 of those 23 species of beaked whales have never been identified alive in the sea. They are known only from animals found on the beach. These animals have been so distinctive that the dead animal itself has formed the basis for the description of a new species. And 1 or more of these species could live in Oregon waters. So why care about beaked whales? There are 2 reasons for me. First, they represent a largely unknown part of the wondrous diversity of our oceans, and learning more about them is, to put it simply, awe-inspiring. But second, we are increasingly learning that beaked whales are vulnerable to all kinds of threats that we humans are creating in the world's oceans. In particular, our oceans are extremely noisy places for lots of reasons, including humans. Ship traffic, seismic testing for science and oil exploration, military use of high-intensity sonar to detect submarines. These are just a few examples. These sound sources have resulted in the deaths of untold numbers of beaked whales, apparently because a fright response causes individuals in deep water to bolt to the surface, and that can result in Benz-like symptoms and death for these animals. We know so very little about beaked whale numbers and distributions, even how many species there are. The ability to identify them to the species level makes it possible for these elusive animals for us to learn more about them by, among other things, listening for their calls and being able to identify the call to the species identification. So with this in mind, we put together an expedition with hopes to provide essential information to better understand beaked whales and to assess their vulnerabilities to anthropogenic or human-caused sound. Our explicit goal was to find one of these cryptic species and link its acoustic call with its visual characteristics. So on this expedition, we were 12 strong, 7 scientists and 5 crew, and we were headed out to the Pacific Ocean for 30 days. This is us setting sail on a Sunday morning in early September of 2021, when after a Herculean effort from the science ship and shoreside team, we left the Newport Bay, and we were accompanied by a bustle of recreational boats headed out for a Saturday on the water, California sea lions barking, Guam merchants calling for their fathers, and gulls tagging along with whatever you can do. We were on the Pacific Storm, built as a commercial trawler, donated to our institute and refitted as a research vessel. 84 feet long, and the crow's nest where we planned to search for whales in that vast ocean was 25 feet above sea level. On board, we had two critical, what I will call science powers aboard, along with the world's best scientists in these two fields. Our first science power was the ability to listen to the ocean with an explicit focus on beaked whales. Here you see Anna Maria, one of our scientists, at our Acoustics Control Center. Anna Maria is listening to underwater sounds in real time, detected by a long cable containing underwater microphones, known as hydrophones, towed behind our Pacific Storm. We use a variety of software tools to visualize these sounds because our human sense of vision is much better than our sense of hearing, quite unlike the beaked whales that we were looking for. Now, this is what Anna Maria is concentrating on. Our primary display, which is the top panel here, consists of little dots, each representing a whale's echolocation click. And each of the colors here represents a different frequency. These dots scroll across the screen in real time from left to right. They're visible for about 1 minute and then they disappear off the screen to the right as new clicks continue to stream in from the left. Now, Anna Maria can click her mouse on any dot she's interested in, and that produces the 3 plots on the lower left. These tell us about the time and location of the animal that produced them, and they give us clues about what species produced that echolocation click. Beaked whale clicks have a unique shape that you can see in the plot with the green background. The shape of the curve and the placement of the peaks in the 2 plots to the left of the green one provide us with information that can, in some cases, help determine what species is making this click. This is Baird's beaked whale at the surface, and we had an extraordinary encounter with them about 50 miles offshore of Central Oregon. Now remember, these whales, Baird's beaked whale and all beaked whales, are silent at the surface, but at depth, they vocalize. And in the upper left and lower right are sound clips, visual representations of those sound clips recorded from this encounter. And I'm going to play what that sounds like and ask you to watch the image scroll by on the upper left as the sound plays. Each of those lines is a click from a single whale. Beaked whales use these clicks to look for prey items, and each click presents them with a picture of their environment, much like sonar or radar. Now I'll ask you, when I played that, did you hear anything? Neither did I. That's because most marine mammals vocalize outside of the human hearing range. And this is why we need so many visual displays to see this ultrasonic sound. Each display provides specific information about these vocalizations, maps indicating the location of the sounds, and forms for recording additional data. Now I want to play that same recording slowed down so the frequency is more attuned to human ears. And I'll ask you to listen for faint echolocation clicks like this. Now still, I'll warn you, beaked whale clicks are notoriously difficult to hear. So Listen closely. Did you hear anything? And I'll tell you that if you did, you're likely to be young and female. I don't have time to tell you why, but it's an interesting fact. Those were echolocation clicks of a Baird's beaked whale below the surface looking for squid. So the second science power that we had aboard the Pacific Storm were these 25 power by 150 high-powered binoculars. We mounted them on the crow's nest of the Pacific Storm and used them to search the ocean all around us, out to the horizon, from sunup to sundown when the sea conditions allowed. And on this particular day, you can see that the sea conditions were very lovely. Now remember, our goal was to link the distinctive vocalizations we were hearing from animals below the surface with their appearance once they came to the sea surface to breathe. That way, we could identify the species as with respect to what it looked like, with respect to also what the sound it produced was. And we were particularly interested in the size of the animal, the shape and placement of the dorsal fin, the color and any patterning along the body. And especially if we were lucky enough to see an adult male, we were really interested in the teeth, their size, their shape, placement in the lower jaw. And as you remember, females and subadults all tend to look alike. So it's the adult males that have these species-specific characteristics of the teeth. So it was September 22nd of 2021. We were about 200 nautical miles west of the Columbia River mouth. Anna Maria and Daniel were monitoring the sounds coming in from our hydrophone towed behind the Pacific Storm. Our software was translating the inaudible ultrasonic signals that we were hearing, that we were recording, into visual representations. When the computer screen showed a type of beaked whale signal that neither of them had ever seen before. Just 3 minutes later, the mystery whales stopped vocalizing. Anna Maria knew exactly what that meant. They would soon be coming to the sea surface. And so she immediately directed the captain to pilot our research vessel, Pacific Storm, toward where she thought they might surface. Very unfortunately, we had high winds and heavy seas that day, very poor sighting conditions. Nonetheless, all aboard were called to join in the visual search from decks all around the boat, with what we expected was a very faint hope of visually finding the whales before their next dive. We were 80 minutes above the ship on the decks looking all around, and after 80 minutes, we saw them. In the very poor condition, Claude, Greg, and Bob had their long lenses on their cameras and their motor drives were firing at full speed. Jay was on deck. We knew that at any moment the whales could dive or we would lose them behind a wave or in the sun flare. Any moment, their last fight. And then, to our amazement, they came over to them. There were a pair of them, and repeatedly they approached the ship, following in our quarter wake, swimming in front of the bow along either side of us. They were about 15 feet long, with spindle-shaped bodies, moderately sloping melon, and medium-length beak. The jawline was relatively straight, but with a slight arch toward the back. The dorsal fin was about 2/3 of the way along the back, bulkhead wide-based, low, and triangular. The overall coloration of these animals was a medium gray. No distinct color patterning around the face. In total, we spent just over 40 minutes with these animals at the surface. And we got fantastic looks, thousands of photos, and this great video footage.
Right. Wow.
Here are some still photos of these animals. You can see the water droplets associated with the blow of this animal as it surfaces. Here's a great look at the head, the beak, the jaw line. Here's the dorsal fin and the mottled skin. And here is the eye, just above the waterline. You can also see the dimple in the top of the head where the blowhole is. The yellow colored spots here that you see are patches of diatoms growing on the skin. And this is fairly common for beaked whales and other whales in high latitudes. And as we were intensely watching the whales, at times it seemed that they may have been intensely watching us. But despite their inquisitive behavior, these close approaches during a prolonged period of time, and the fact that we had the world's best beaked whale authorities on board as part of our science team, despite all that, we were unable to determine what species they were. And that's because these were sub-adult animals. Remember, for most beaked whales, if they are not adult males, all of them look pretty much the same. But our expedition team did not give up easily. Standing on the bow with crossbow in hand, Bob took aim and fired a 2-foot-long lightweight dart at one of the whales. And here you can see that dart on its way toward the target, which is the upper back of the animal, just in front of the dorsal fin. And as an aside, by the way, that red wound that you see on the top of the back, that red wound is a relatively fresh cookie cutter shark bite. Now, Bob has collected thousands of these samples from all kinds of whales, dolphins, and porpoises around the planet. And this dart hit its mark. Here you can see it just before it landed in the water. And that tiny pink bit at the tip of the dart, that's, I have drawn the yellow circle around, that tiny pink bit is a pencil eraser-sized piece of skin and blubber of our mystery whale. The DNA contained in that biopsy sample held the key to this species identification. We were at sea for just one more day. Then we returned to Newport, unpacked the Pacific Storm, and all of us returned to our respective homes and workplaces across the country. But the science continued. The very first thing we did when we landed in Newport was we took that biopsy sample from the Pacific Storm and took it straight to our Cetacean Conservation and Genomics Laboratory here in the Marine Mammal Institute. And Scott Baker and Debbie Steele immediately went to work. 5 days later, we had our answer. Our mystery whales were Hubb's beaked whale. The Latin name is Mesoplodon carl-hubbsi. And our biopsied whale was a female. So now I want to take a moment to put this into perspective. In 1945, a preeminent American ichthyologist described a beaked whale found alive in the surf near his office in La Jolla, California. The skull and the color pattern of that beaked whale were different from any whale previously known to science, and it ultimately became recognized as a new species, Hubb's beaked whale. But for the next 50 years, it would be known only from specimens found dead on beaches. Fast forward to 1994, when a NOAA research vessel was conducting a marine mammal survey off the coast of Oregon. The science team that actually included Robert Pittman, who was a part of our expedition, and the same Bob who collected our biopsy sample. Back in 1994, on that NOAA vessel, Bob spotted a group of Hubb's beaked whales, identified by the unique color pattern of the adult male. It was the first and only time that that species had ever been identified alive in the wild. And it would not be identified alive again until our project. Meanwhile, acousticians, including our acoustics lead, Jay Barlow, were busy listening to the oceans and recording beaked whale signals. One of these, a distinctive and unique signal that was previously recorded in 2016 and 2018, that call was named BW37V in a paper that was published in 2019. And it was on the day of our extraordinary encounter with that pair of mystery beaked whales that our acoustics team recorded that call again. And that's when we discovered that the call named BW37V is Hubb's beaked whale. Now, linking an acoustic call with a visual description of a poorly known whale and confirming the species identification through genetics is an extremely powerful tool. Instantly, we now know a lot more about the at-sea distribution of this rare whale. It occurs everywhere that call, BW37V, has been recorded. And here's a map of where scientists have listened for those calls all across the Pacific Ocean. The filled circles and squares in this map are where Hubb's beaked whale has been recorded, that magic call BW37V. The open circles and squares are where we have listened for calls, but not heard that special call. So we now know that Hubb's beaked whale is concentrated in temperate waters of the Eastern Pacific and not found in the Central Pacific. Science often, in fact, most often, is part serendipity. I have not told you tonight that our initial goal for our expedition was to reach the infamous garbage patch in the Eastern Pacific Gyre, way far into the vast Pacific. We didn't want to go there to study garbage. We wanted to go there because there were reported sightings of mystery beaked whales. However, engine transmission problems forced us to return to Newport early. Our incredibly skilled crew were able to complete repairs in short order, and we were able to go back to sea, but we didn't have enough time to get out to the garbage patch. So we used our remaining sea time to explore the offshore waters of Oregon. And it turns out that we solved a mystery in our own backyard, although perhaps only oceanographers and fishermen would consider 200 miles to be our backyard. But this adversity, challenge, risk, camaraderie, and occasionally extraordinary discovery, this is why I became a marine scientist. I want to acknowledge that this research has been a collaboration between the Marine Mammal Institute of Oregon State University and NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. We were a very tight team of scientists from both institutions. And as a special acknowledgement, how many of you have seen these license plates around the state of Oregon? It's a beautiful piece of art representing a gray whale female and her calf. And for every plate sold or renewed, our Marine Mammal Institute receives $35 to support our research, education, and outreach. And this particular expedition to look for beaked whales was supported in part by these funds. Without them, our research wouldn't have been possible. So for all of you out there that have these license plates, thank you so much for helping us make this possible. Our beaked whale expedition was a fantastic success, an awesome example of local research with global impact. And by the way, those whales that have never been seen alive in the wild, those whales are still out there, and we haven't forgotten. We're working hard to plan and conduct another expedition to search for them next spring. So I'll ask you to watch this space And now I'll thank you for giving me the opportunity to tell you one of my favorite stories about these magnificent and mysterious whales.
Thank you, Lisa. That was fascinating. Let's all unmute quickly and give a brief round of applause before we jump into questions.
Very good.
All right, thank you again. Yeah, that is amazing. I recall hearing of beaked whales and knowing a little bit about them, but just the amount that's not known is really incredible. So I'm imagining very little is known about their population dynamics. Is there a particular species that's better known than others, and is it at all a proxy for understanding the others, or does their ecology vary a lot?
Yeah. Okay, really good questions. Thank you for those, August. As I said at the beginning of the talk, all of the species of beaked whales fall into a single family. And the family of beaked whales is the most speciose of all the families of cetaceans, whales, dolphins, and porpoises. There's a lot of speculation about why that single family is so speciose, and I don't really have the time to go too deeply into that. Plus, we don't really know why it's the most speciose. But it turns out that, yeah, we really don't know a lot about most of the species, including, even what they look like at sea. Some species are relatively well known, and I just want to say well known relative to the other species of beaked whales. There's one called Cuvier's beaked whale that I spoke about a lot in my talk, that is relatively commonly seen, relatively commonly photographed. It's relatively easy to identify. And from surveys at sea, we have been able to repeatedly collect enough information on them from visual and acoustic surveys to do some very rough estimates of not absolute abundance, but sort of relative abundance estimates, and then through time estimate whether the numbers might be increasing or decreasing. And here off the California current, for example, that species has shown an indication that the trend is decreasing, that they are decreasing in abundance. But the reasons for that are unknown, and we cannot say that that is a proxy for any other species of beaked whales, just simply because we don't know enough about them. We really need to be able to understand a lot more about all of these species before we'll be able to see or be able to say anything about whether you can use one species as a proxy for others. I think I will say one more thing on that topic, which is that acoustics, passive acoustics, is a real important tool for them because they spend most of their lives underneath the water. And when they're under the water, they're vocalizing. When they come to the surface, they're difficult to see and they're difficult to identify. So really one of the key ways of studying them is just by listening. And we're increasingly being able to identify species according to their calls. That's why this was such an exciting expedition. And then turn those calls into estimates of relative abundance, certainly distribution, and then maybe trends over time.
So it looks like I was muted. Thank you. Our next question is from Margaret Essenberg.
How do they avoid getting the bends when they rise to the surface on normal occasions when they're not frightened?
That's a good question. And cetaceans, as well as pinnipeds, seals and sea lions, they have very different respiratory systems than humans or terrestrial mammals. And one of the things that they do is when they go, as soon as they go dive underneath the water, their entire respiratory system collapses. So their the alveoli in the lungs themselves, they just collapse. Now, if that happened to you and me, we'd be toast. That'd be it. Because our alveoli and the respiratory, the bronchioles, they would just stick together and there's no unsticking them. But cetaceans and pinnipeds, whales, dolphins, porpoises, seals, and sea lions have these reinforced passages in their respiratory systems with cartilage. And so when they go to depth, they collapse their respiratory system. One of the things that does is that at depth, there's incredible pressure and it protects the air spaces from getting injured if they just go on ahead and collapse them. But the other thing that does when they're at depth is it prevents air exchange between the gas in the lungs and the bloodstream. And it's that exchange at depth that causes the bubbles to come out into the bloodstream when humans surface. So that's in a nutshell how they do it. It's just really amazing adaptations and differences in their respiratory systems from terrestrial mammals.
So where is all the oxygen that is supporting them for that long dive? Is it dissolved in the blood?
Great question. That is a great question. And so deep diving mammals like these beaked whales, like sperm whales, like a lot of deep diving pinnipeds, elephant seals are famous for that. The oxygen that sustains them when they are at depth is, yes, it's dissolved in the blood. It's stored in the muscle. They have a very high myoglobin content in the muscle itself, and that's mainly where it's stored. Much higher oxygen storage capacity in the blood and the muscle tissue than for terrestrial mammals.
Amazing. Wow.
It is amazing. It's amazing.
Thank you. Our next question is from Tim and Karen.
Guess I better unmute, huh? I was wondering if so there are many of species of the beaked whales, but within a species, is the vocalization the same, or are there variations within individuals of the same species?
That is a great question. And I'm sorry to say the answer is we don't know. Right now, we are still at the stage research-wise where we're trying to identify these calls just to the species. And that's one of the exciting things about our expedition is that we were able to identify a well-known call and link it to this species. But your question is a really good one, because as we study other species of particularly dolphins, but also in some cases whales, sperm whales or humpback whales, or even blue whales, but bottlenose dolphins, we do find that there are individual differences within a particular species in subtle differences in those calls. And in general, these whales, dolphins, and porpoises tend to be highly social animals. So vocal signals are an important way of communicating and maintaining that social structure. But it's a great question for beaked whales. We don't know the answer yet.
So I have a follow-up then on that chart that you were showing of the particular, I forget, V such and such, whatever the number was. That was the individual that you were tracing, not just the species, correct?
Yes, the call that we recorded was made from one or maybe both of those animals that we saw that came to the surface. And that call had a characteristic shape and waveform that had been recognized very broadly across the North Pacific, in fact. So So the call, we assume that call is made by Hubb's beaked whale, but we just haven't been able to dissect the calls and link or look at the more subtle differences potentially between individuals within that same species.
Thank you. That's really interesting.
We have a great follow-up question from Annalise.
Hello. So I have two questions. The first one is roughly how many identified calls have been attributed to a single species of beak whale? So like you mentioned specific calls, how many of them have been matched? And then also, do we know anything about what clicks are used purely for like echolocation on dives, or do we know anything about maybe some that are used for conspecific communication between their pairs? Thank you.
Sure. Those are both great questions. And I'm going to take the echolocation clicks versus communication calls question first. Cetaceans, that is whales, dolphins, and porpoises, are divided into two groups, the baleen whales and the toothed whales. And any whale, whales like sperm whales, dolphins, or porpoises that have teeth fall in the toothed whale category. And they are the big echolocators. They all echolocate. Echolocation and the degree to which echolocation is developed and used is directly correlated with how deep animals dive. So the deep divers, like beaked whales, like sperm whales, and like a few other cryptic species of dolphins that dive really deep and stay down underneath long, they have very well developed echolocation. And it makes sense because they're feeding in the dark. They can't use vision at all. So they really have to use echolocation for everything underneath, not only to locate prey, but to locate anything else. Shallower animals that live in shallower depths also use echolocation, but to a much lesser extent because they can also rely on vision. Interestingly, there is a shallow, a group of dolphins that live in shallow water, and those are the river dolphins. There are a number of species of river dolphin, but they live in waters that are so turbid that vision becomes essentially non-functional, and they too have extremely well developed echolocation capabilities. So back to your question about echolocation clicks versus vocalizations that are used for communication. They have really different characteristics, those different types of calls. The echolocation clicks are just what it sounds like, they're clicks. So it's very easy to tell when you're listening to something, that's an echolocation click. A call or a whistle is not echolocation, that's used for communication purposes. So I hope that sort of answered your question. The communication calls are quite diverse. There are a whole bunch of different communication calls, both between species, but even within a single species. There can be quite diverse communication calls. In bottlenose dolphins, we know of these things called signature whistles that people have drawn analogies to our names. Each dolphin has a unique whistle to itself, somewhat like, your name is unique. So, and I forget the first question that you asked me.
Yeah, go ahead and repeat it. I wanted to know roughly how many of the identified calls have been attributed to a single species.
Yes. So for beaked whales, that's a really good question, Annalise, and I don't have the exact number. 23 species of Mesoplodon, 6 of them have never been seen alive in the wild even. So if I were to make a rough estimate, I would say maybe 5 to 8. Okay. So we have a lot of work to do there.
Thank you.
Great. Do we have any more questions? Got one more, but I'll hold it. See if there are any more from the audience.
One big question's mine.
All right. So my maybe quick question is at the beginning you briefly mentioned that blue whales seem to be increasing in population off our coasts. And I found that interesting just because it seems like, you know, a general sort of trend is that some of the largest mammals are decreasing in population generally. So what's going on there? Do we know?
Yeah, that's a great question. I love to talk about this. It's a great question to end with, August, because it's a happy story.
Good.
Whales, as I'm sure everyone here tonight knows, were heavily exploited commercially through industrial whaling in the late 1800s and the 1900s, all the way through to the 60s and even the 70s. So industrial whaling, commercialized whaling, drove populations of whales down way low, and they did that on a global scale, extirpating many populations locally around the world. In 1972, well, in the 1970s and 1980s, this sort of magnitude of devastation came to popular awareness, and two very powerful statutes were passed in the United States. You've heard of them, the Marine Mammal Protection Act and the Endangered Species Act. And to this day, all marine mammals continue to be protected under the Marine Mammal Protection Act, whether they're rare or not. And that has led to some problems, but that's a whole nother story. But there's a way of, and it's not a perfect way, but assessing whether a species is threatened, endangered, or fine. And if they're endangered, of course, they're listed under the Endangered Species Act. So all of the great whales that had been hunted commercially were listed under the Marine Mammal Protection Act and the Endangered Species Act. And most of the great whales continue to be listed under the Endangered Species Act. Gray whales, for example, were the first ones to come off, a huge recovery conservation success story. But the short answer to your question is that those statutes and other protections through other countries and international agreements have resulted in many cases of whale populations coming roaring back, recovering. And it's a happy story, because what it means is that if we just protect or stop killing whales, they can and they will recover. The interesting thing that we're seeing, though, now is that as large whale populations are recovering, and there are a lot of blue whales now off of our coast of Oregon, a lot of fin whales, huge numbers of humpback whales. It's so exciting for somebody like me, but I think it's exciting for most people. But it also brings a lot of human-wildlife conflict. So everyone here has probably heard about ship strikes on large whales. And that's the result of the fact that we have a lot of ships out there, but it's also the result that whales are recovering. And so there are more whales today than there were 30 years ago. So those human-wildlife conflicts are coming into the forefront as populations that used to be pushed down because of direct exploitation, as those populations are recovering. But that's the reason. And it's, again, it's a very, I guess I find it quite happy that if we actually do, it can be a relatively simple fix, that you can just protect animals, stop killing them, and they can recover. But then there are consequences, because the world that they recover in is not the world of the late 1800s, when they were, hunted commercially.